Okay, this video is going to be about multiplying real numbers or multiplying integers. We'll start with integers and then we'll move on to all kinds of real numbers. So the rules are pretty simple. If we have the same signs, the answer is going to be positive. For instance, a positive times a positive is equal to a positive, and a negative times a negative is equal to a positive. If we have one of each sign, then the answer is going to be negative. A positive times a negative is a negative, or a negative times a positive is a negative. Now, there are a lot of ways to remember this. I can show you that a negative times a negative is going to be a positive by doing a little animation where I take one of the signs and I put it out here already, and then I take the other negative sign and I loop it up and I make a positive sign. So that's my animation. Another way of showing it is what I call my little Christmas tree diagram. So I've got my star up here on top and the branches of my Christmas tree. And however I follow this around, I get my answer. So if I want to multiply a negative times a positive, then my answer is going to be negative. And if I want to multiply a positive times a negative, then my answer is going to be a negative. And if I want to multiply a negative times a negative, then my answer is positive. And I can do this the opposite way around. A positive times a negative is going to give me a negative. And a negative times a negative is going to give me a positive. And so this diagram works all the way around. And then there's my story method of telling you how to get negatives. The story goes like this. I have a grandma that's helped by a 12-year-old. And I have a story about a 12-year-old who robs a bank. Which one's the news going to tell you about? If they can only carry one. Well, I am of the opinion that the news is most likely going to tell you about the sensational one, right? The nasty story about the 12-year-old who robs the banks. And that's the negative story, right? So if we have a positive story and a negative story, which one wins out? The negative one, unfortunately. So the negative always wins out when I have a positive and a negative story. I get the negative story. Okay, so those are all the ways to help you to remember, or not all of them, but a few ways to help you remember how to multiply integers or real numbers. All right, we're going to start with some integers here. So we have a negative 3 times a negative 5. Remember, when one number or both numbers is written in a parenthesis, that means that we're doing multiplication. So this says a negative times a negative, which is a positive number. And then I'm going to multiply 3 and 5, which is 15. And I highly recommend that you deal with multiplying and dividing integers in the same fashion every time. So deal with the signs first and then the multiplying or dividing, or the multiplying and dividing and then do the signs first. That way you don't forget, because it is easy to forget about those signs. Signs are most often forgotten just on accident. All right, negative divided by a positive is going to be a negative, and 15 divided by 5 is 3. And there we go with our answer there. And finally, 625 divided by a negative 25, a positive divided by a negative is going to be a negative. 25 will go into 62 2 times. That's going to give me 50. And then I'm going to subtract. 2 minus 0 is 2. 6 minus 5 is 1. And then I bring down the 5. And 25 will go into 125 5 times. And 5 times 125 is 125. And 125 minus 125 is 0. And so that's my final answer. All right, now let's move on and do some real numbers. So I have a negative number times a negative number. So when I multiply a negative times a negative, I get a positive. When I multiply decimals, remember I just ignore the decimals at first, so I'm just going to multiply 3 times 101. If you have to go over here and write 101 times 3, there is no harm in that whatsoever, but I would do it personally just by saying 3 times 1 is 3. 3 times 0 is 0. 3 times 1 is 3. And then I see there's 1, 2 decimals in these factors, so I'm going to put 1, 2 decimals into my answer. And that will be my final answer, 3.03. And it is positive, you don't have to have that. A negative divided by a positive is going to yield a negative number, and this is probably more easily done by making it a long division problem. So we have my long division of 6075 divided by 0.03. Now remember that we can't do division without moving the decimal out. So I'm going to move the decimal out here, which means it comes up into my divisor. And now all I'm doing is 3 into there. 3 will go into 6 2 times, 3 will go into 0 0 times, 3 will go into 7 2 times, with 1 left over. That's short division, remember, so 3 times 2 is 6, 7 minus 6 is 1, and now the 1 goes along with the 5, making 15, and 3 will go into 15 5 times. And so there's my final answer on that one. Now moving along, here are some more integers. Notice I changed my instruction set to simplify. Doesn't matter, means the exact same thing. When I multiply a negative times a positive, I'm going to get a negative. When I multiply a fraction and a whole number, I put the whole number over the top of 1. And now I multiply numerators. 3 times 1, which is 3. 4 times 1 in the denominator, which is 4, and therefore my answer is negative 3/4. When I multiply mixed numbers, I am going to have these as improper fractions. It's still an negative improper fraction, so I'll put the negative there. 3 times 1 plus 1, that doesn't change. It doesn't have anything to do with this negative. 3 times 1 is 3 plus 1 is 4. That goes over the the denominator of 3. And this is being divided by, and that's going to be a negative number here. And again, this has nothing to do with the improper fraction. 2 times 8 is 16 plus 1 is 17. And that goes over the top of 8. Now, I'm just simply going to multiply by the reciprocal as I normally would, so negative 4/3 times, and then the reciprocal, which is 8/17. So there's my final problem to work. Now, a negative times a negative is going to give me a positive. And 17 and 4 have nothing in common, 4 and 3 have nothing in common, 8 and 3 have nothing in common, 8 and 17 have nothing in common. So I'm going to multiply straight across the numerators. 4 times 8, which is 32, and then 17 times 3. If you need to, don't hesitate to go up here and write it as a multiplication problem and do your multiplication and carry and everything you need to do. I discourage you at this time to be using your calculator. You really need to get your skills in hand. And then our final answer is 32/51. And that is simplifying those real number problems. Now it's your turn. So I would encourage you to shut off the video, try these on your very own, and then come back and see if you've gotten the correct answers. Alright, so a negative divided by a positive, which is a negative. And then 27 divided by 9 is 3. Next one, we have a fraction multiplied by a mixed number. So I'm going to change the mixed number into an improper fraction. So now I'm going to have 1/3 times a negative 2 times 8, which is 16, plus 1, which is 17, and those are 8s. And now I'm ready to go ahead and multiply. A positive times a negative is a negative, and there is no canceling, so I'm going to multiply straight across the numerators. 17 times 1, which is 17. Straight across the denominators, 8 times 3, which is 24. And because there was no canceling, this is not going to reduce, so that'll be my final answer. Now the last problem down here, this one is going to be a long division problem, so I might want to write that out as 1.08 divided by 0.04. When I get my answer, a negative divided by a negative is going to be a positive, so my answer is going to be a positive. And I can't divide by a decimal without moving that decimal out, so I'm going to move it over 2 places, moving it over 2 places, moving that up into the divisor, into the quotient, and now I have just this 4 that I'm dividing by. 4 goes into 10, 2 times. 4 times 2 is 8. 10 minus 8 is 2, so that's going to get put up there for short division, and 4 goes into 28 7 times, and that answer is positive 27 because I'd already noted that it would be a positive answer. So hopefully that went really well for you and you got the hang of multiplying real numbers or multiplying integers.